right? It's the Maccabees who really are the ones during the 2nd century who are going to bring the Torah to the center of the community. Before that, even though Ezra and Nehemiah says it was, in keeping with the divine plan, after they had been conquered, they repent, return, but we know that's not the case. There is a community, they write to Jerusalem, they worship Yahweh, but they worship Yahweh's wife too. They worship they give money to sacrifices to Khnum and other Egyptian gods and so forth. It seems they have a lot of different things that are just clearly idolatrous. And the priests in Jerusalem and the authorities in Jerusalem they should say, we would expect them to say, we have nothing to do with you backsliders. We will have nothing to do with your community. We are not going to support you to build a temple to Yahweh and his wife. The only temple, according to the Torah, is to be built in Jerusalem. We go back to one family. Now that we're defeated and conquered, we got to come together. We were a family, a nation. That's new. We don't have narratives of peoples in relation to other peoples like we have in Herodotus and Thucydides and in Greek history writing. We don't have that in the ancient Near East, but we have it in the Bible. Then the question is, so what's the connection?
We are Myth Vision. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I have Dr. Jacob L. Wright joining us today. How are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, Derek. Nice to be on your show.
I'm excited to have you here. In fact, you have a book that you've just launched that is so important on answering the question of why the Bible was written, period. Can you tell us a little bit about this book?
The question why is really the central question for me. The books that we have on the Bible, one of the biggest books is Who Wrote the Bible? And it's by Dick Friedman, Richard Elliott Friedman. He says, there's a scribe under Jeremiah, Baruch, and he tries to give a name to it. And I think all that kind of speculation is not helpful. So, who wrote the Bible? Well, my answer is a bunch of nameless scribes, generations of scribes who we know nothing about. And trying to put a name on it is really unhelpful. So there are a lot of books on who, where, when the Bible was written. And that's a big part of my project. And then there's also this what question, what the Bible teaches. And there's this war between, is the morality of the Bible something that we should adopt in our societies? Or no, the morality of the Bible is really so old and awful and so forth. So there's that war there. My question is why? Why was the Bible written? And that question has never really been addressed in biblical scholarship. And the reason why, it's really a minefield. To try to explain why a text was written goes to the heart of theological questions. And let's face it, there are a lot of biblical scholars who may not belong to a religious kind of affiliation, but they still are guided by presuppositions that are very theological, and they avoid issues that are going to offend believers. And I'm not trying to offend believers, but I am trying to tell the truth because I think it's helpful and to explain why we have a Bible. And I hope that it helps. I think it's getting a lot of resonance with people. It's one of the best 5 books on religion, according to the Publishers Weekly. And this is a book on the Bible. And it also, though, goes and debunks hypotheses and long-held traditions and theological positions. And it's still getting a lot of traction among people who care.
Dr. Wright, your book is also up there for 2023 on the New Yorker. So this is a very important book. It's resonating with many people. I hope people watching this right now will go down in the description, get you a copy, read it for yourself, and let us know what you think about it. Because I'm telling you, this question and how we explain this, I think will solve a lot of things and change a lot of things within the scholarship of the field that I've read. So can you tell us, at least give us the tease as to what led up to writing the Bible?
Defeat. My answer, that's my puppy Hank just walking out. Defeat is the answer for why we have a Bible. There was a kingdom. There was actually two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And they were both destroyed by empires, the Assyrian Empire and then the Babylonian Empire. And because these empires destroyed these kingdoms, that's why we have a Bible. We don't have a Bible because it goes back to Moses receiving revelation. A lot of people now maybe don't agree with that position, but they still try to trace old texts back to King David and Solomon's court and so forth. Maybe we have some old text, but they have been thoroughly reshaped as a roadmap for survival for a community that had been conquered. Now, that's a problem for many people, you can imagine, right? It explains all of the Bible, all of the theology, all of the religious innovation, the very fact that we have a text. It explains it by natural reasons, very humanistic reasons. And for people who aren't easily offended, like the Adam Gopnik at the New Yorker, they find real truth and meaning from this because the truth does help us, right? And I guess religious conservatives might be offended by it. I get some emails, quite a few every day about this. I get someone praying for me, hoping that I'll accept Jesus. I'm Jewish, but Jesus was a nice Jewish guy, but I'm not going to accept any kind of stuff that doesn't get to the heart of truth. And the truth is going to set us free. I really do believe that. And the truth of my project is the Bible is a human response, an ingenious one, but a human response to defeat. It can be thoroughly explained by a community living on the margins who don't know how to survive when empires are no longer allowing them to have kingdoms and to have territorial sovereignty and a palace and so forth. And they reorient their attention from the king to a god, and they reorient their attention to a text.
You actually are in the vein of exactly what Myth Vision's all about. We want to solve the riddles of ancient history and the sands of time, with thumbprints, not with abracadabra, ghost, and mystical kind of explanations. And this is right in the vein of how do we explain this? If we, our analogy here, Scooby-Doo. Growing up, I used to watch a lot of it. And there's always a ghost, a demon, a monster people are always searching for. And at the end of the episode, almost every episode, we find them unmasked and there's a human behind the story of the
that's wonderful.
The spiritual. And so we're aiming at it that way, trying to explain this human wise. And it was defeat that led this way. Your book chronicles different texts and goes through different material over time. Can you kind of
let's lay it out a bit. So there are 4 parts to the book. And in the first part, I go through all of the biblical narratives side by side with the archaeological record and the historical sources. And I show how the two really diverge drastically. If you look at an introduction to the Bible that's being taught within colleges and seminaries and so forth, they're not helpful because what they do is they begin with the narrative and try to show where it overlaps, where it doesn't, but it's kind of just a messy thing. What we try to do as critical scholars is to separate the archaeology and let the archaeological record speak, the pottery speak. Pottery is the stuff that we find. That's the most important stuff because it allows us to date things. And then allow the text on its own to have its message. And we try to then to come back and say, so when can we date this text on the basis of the archaeological record? The text that we have has been transmitted. The oldest copies we have, we found around the time of Jesus. But scholars and everybody believes they go farther back. How much farther back is the question? I don't think it goes back to King David and Solomon and all these kings like they're trying to argue. And the reason why they're trying to argue that is because they don't want it to be just about defeat. If it originated somewhere in the sands of time and what have you, and it can be traced to a time of where the kingdom was prospering and flourishing and all of that, then It could be someone sitting under a tree thinking about what is true, what is right, and coming up with this. But if it's all a response to trauma, collective trauma, and a way to bring communities together, that's problematic because it sounds like social engineering. Well, social engineering happens a lot, and it can be problematic, and there can be good kinds of things. And this is a text that has problems, and there's good stuff to it, but it's thoroughly human. And so in the first part of the book, I go through the archaeological record and I show all these archives that we have going all the way back, for example, to the Amarna letters from Egypt that show that Egypt was actually in the land. Israel couldn't have escaped Egypt because when they go to Canaan, the Egyptians are there waiting for them during that time. And I look at different archives and through the history. That's the first part. And then I start talking about after defeat. What were the steps that they took to move their attention and orientation from a kingdom and the palace and King David to the stuff that we have in the books of Genesis, Exodus, all of that stuff. And that is this prehistory that they create in order to show that, hey, we were a people before there was a kingdom. We can also be a people now. And so they construct a past that is mythic. Right. And you know very well that myths do contain valuable insights. But let's be honest about not trying to make them in some way mixing the kind of historicity and so forth. And all of my colleagues, not all of them, I shouldn't say, but many of them just get fuzzy around those details. And I think it's helpful. I know that you've had people on the show who are more, akin with my approach, that we need to be very clear about these things. We're not trying to offend people. And if you are offended, then maybe you should grow up. I move in that second part to looking at how the Bible emerges around the kinds of questions that emerge in this time of imperial occupation. The Persian Empire is controlling the world. And then there's this little community around Jerusalem and the north and so forth, and they're working out their issues. And those two other parts are just looking at the different kinds of what are the themes of the Bible. Let's look at various kinds of things that people are really concerned about and show how they actually are responses to defeat, to conquest. And I go through each one of them, from theology to all of the kinds of things around books that you would never imagine were like a response to defeat. And I say, this is the best explanation.
This is really interesting to consider and think for the viewer. You kind of have this repetitive theme of restoration. Oh, crap, we screwed up. Boom, exile or some type of punishment. Oh, boom, God sends help, whether it's judges, whether it's prophets, whether it's heroes or a king, whoever it is, he's trying to send them help. And this idea of over and over exile, restoration, all the way from Genesis, really till you get to these late prophets and dealing with Persia and stuff. And I kind of wanted you to tease us with some of those examples. Like, I'll give you an example. I interviewed John Collins, right? Flew up there, saw him the week he was retiring. He handed me a bunch of books to take home. I felt like a lucky guy. Nice. And I asked him, hey, do you think the Exodus ever happened? He laughs. Of course not. I don't think the Exodus happened. Well, what do you think it was? And I would probably putting words in his mouth that I shouldn't. But I think he said something like a king who was exiled from Israel was sent to Egypt. He escaped during some trial or bad situation. His people were like, get out. And they were going to kill him if not. So he left to Egypt. And then later he comes back. So based on this real possible king that really had to go to Egypt to escape, then comes back and he's restored. And I can't remember if this is
it's in the Bible. There is something like that. It's in the book of Kings. Yeah.
So that was his thing. He thought, well, it could have been then. He's not certain. But your point is to say, post defeat, here we are exiled to Babylon. We get rescued. Notice they always give the credit to Yahweh for what Marduk. If you actually look at the sources, it's like Marduk was the one who actually did these things, but Yahweh gets the credit. And then they're coming back to restore and build Jerusalem, and it's always the elites who are writing this stuff. Do you think the Exodus with Moses is actually a Persian potentially post-Persia, even Greek invention of a story. Like you said, they're creating the mythical history of the past.
Good question. So what Professor Collins says, where he tries to come up with a scenario is, I think, helpful. Yes, the Exodus story is very much a product of the Persian period and later, especially the way we know it. The book of Exodus, we can see it being shaped in the Persian period. What Collins is saying is that there has always been this escaping the Levant, Canaan, and going down to Egypt, because Egypt was a place of asylum, and then coming back. And that's a routine that we see all the way through the Bible and also in extra biblical sources. So the idea of an Exodus is really not that new. It's just a common thing of peoples who live in Egypt moving out and coming back in and all of that. And the Bible picks up on that. We've made a big deal about it. And the reason why we made a big deal about it, it's about salvation. Christians love the idea of the Exodus because it means God saved a people from bondage, and they spiritualize it. And if the Exodus didn't happen, then it's possible that Jesus also will not, and that salvation, I explain, but is very much an attempt to say, no, our kings were not the ones who did this. Our God is the one who did this. Why? Because our kings no longer exist, right? The kingdom has been wiped out. So they have to say, well, they don't have to, but they come up very creatively with this. They say that long before we ever had a kingdom, we were in Egypt. It's a common thing. A lot of us come from Egypt. We were there in slavery, and who brought us out, who saved us? The word is salvation, saved us, Yeshua. Same name as Yeshua, Jesus, Savior. But the one who saved us was, according to Christians, Jesus' Father, Yahweh. And that is, like I said, an attempt to say, well, the real center of our community is our transcendent God, not a political institution like that has been wiped out by the empire. And, you say that too often, you get emails. You get some real death threat type emails because, you know why? It makes sense. It really resonates. People read this and say, yes, that makes sense. I have to say that when I started to read in this stuff when I was in college, it really was eye-opening too. And I expected that scholars would continue along in that vein, but it's so strange that they still are trying to be fuzzy, trying to say, oh, let's just be clear-cut. Conquest is the point of departure for the Bible, not Davidic conquest of other peoples, like they say, but the Davidic dynasty being conquered. And there are two conquests. One is from 722 by the Assyrians. That's the northern kingdom. And so that kind of move towards responding to defeat and moving away from the palace is already embedded there a little bit. But it would be wrong to say that the Bible goes back to 722 or around that time, because whatever that was just an idea. Maybe a little bit of text, but very little. What really snowballs into the corpus that we have is in the Persian period and in the Hellenistic period. And it's not minimalism that I'm trying to argue for necessarily, but I think we need to be a little bit more courageous in stating the facts. And the facts are, the Bible really is through and through a survival manual for a community that no longer has a kingdom.
This kingdom idea, I hear many scholars debate whether or not there was ever a united kingdom initially, or if there were two disparate kingdoms side by side.
Oh, yeah,
and so I must ask you, my friend,
I like that.
What is your stance on
United Kingdom? Is the United Monarchy. The United Kingdom is probably not what we use because it's too much like England, but the United Monarchy is a huge thing for people. I never understood it. Why is that so important? And I think it's a lot about David, and I wrote a book on David too, and it's like I never quite understood the infatuation with David. I try to show David he was just a warlord, kind of an early mafioso who had his band, and he went around and he carved out a little kingdom, and there was nothing about Goliath and nothing about Israel in it either. He's totally Judean. That really pissed people off, that David has nothing to do with Israel. And I developed that idea in my book, this book we're talking about. So the United Kingdom, or the United Monarchy, is an attempt, I try to show, of Judah, right? There's two kingdoms. Judah tries, the Judean kingdom and thereafter tries to say, we were already at one time connected. Jerusalem was the capital that our God chose. The Davidic dynasty was the one that he chose to be the ruler over the nation. And it's all an attempt to bring people to Jerusalem, to the Davidic dynasty, and say the reason we have two kingdoms was because Israel sinned. The northern kingdom sinned and they left us. That resonates with people really well too, because it just makes sense. It makes sense to say, we're not trying something new. We're going back to the way it was before, right? And that's the same kind of principle that we have with the Pentateuch, with the 5 books of Moses. We can be a people without a kingdom because we were in the past. And so they create a mythic past in order to say what we're doing in the present is not new, because no one wants to try out something new. And so the Davidic kingdom idea, the United Monarchy, well, the kingdoms can be joined because they were already joined a long time ago in the most glorious period of our history, and then they broke apart and divided. Well, the archaeological record makes that very problematic. There's nothing to support a united monarchy. And you have all these guys arguing, and some of them are critical scholars occupying huge positions at public universities. They have religious backgrounds. You have to look at some of the professors, where they come from in their training. And you see that many of them came from seminary and they still have religious affiliations and so forth. They're not Bar Ehrmans. They haven't left the fold of that. They still hold on to that at some level. The way they do it is just to make things fuzzy. To say, well, it could be a small United Kingdom, or David. It's like, it's just such a neat principle to set out. This is an attempt by the Davidic dynasty to say that we are the ones who are supposed to rule. We already did it at the beginning. We broke apart, and we need to go back to the God-ordained plan as it was all along. And that principle is picked up in a later point by the people who are trying to say, the covenant, Sinai, the laws, the 10 Commandments, Genesis, all of that. That is where we're going back to, even though that's a mythic past that is even more grandiose than the one about the United Monarchy.
Two things come to mind with what you just said. Powerful is post-Persia, going into the Hellenistic period. Let's just say Persian Hellenistic for the sake of argument, because I think it's a fuzzy area in terms of fully knowing how to nail it.
I think they're basically the same. You have an empire that had been conquered by Alexander the Great, and basically things are the same. So it's very hard to distinguish between Persian and Hellenistic stuff.
And so I'm looking at this, and two things I think of, and one of them I think we'll tackle before we address this issue about the United Monarchy idea. I'm curious to know, post-defeat, they're looking at these massive empires who have a working political system that seems to be better than what they have. So I don't know about you, but I imagine people in failure are not only probably living with, let's just say, animosity toward the larger people, but also they have to compete. In order to even be anybody, they got to compete, and they see it's working. So they model stuff off of the empires in which conquered them, but also they want to spin it. They want to give their own twist on it. They create a mythical past, a history. And I think about the Samaritans, and I think about the Jews. We hear this United Monarchy. I wondered, and this is complete speculation, I wonder if they invented some ancient unity between these two groups by saying we had a northern-southern united monarchy, meaning you Samaritans from Samaria And us, Judeans, we got along in the ancient past. And so they're trying to craft this story as if two Yahweh worshiping sects sometime later, 5th, 4th century BCE, crafting an ancient history where they were united. I don't know.
No, that's the area that I work on Ezra and Nehemiah, where we have this conflict between Samaria and Jerusalem emerging in the first place. I mean, it goes back to these two kingdoms that existed in the Iron Age. And the northern kingdom, Israel, was just 10 times greater than the Judean kingdom. The Bible is a Judean product, but it's from a kingdom that is 10 times smaller and 10 times less significant than the northern kingdom. So during the Persian period and Hellenistic period, you have them reemerging, and Samaria is still stronger. Judah is trying to take that position still, and many of them are fighting with each other and want to break apart, and some of them are trying to come together. And so the Book of Chronicles, which is clearly a Hellenistic book, I mean, we have colleagues who are trying to say it's a Persian period, but it's so clearly Hellenistic because it presupposes the end of the Persian period. Like Ezra and Nehemiah tells the whole story of the Persian Empire. You can't say that's from the Persian Empire because it's reflecting back on it. So, and it's trying to, in the Hellenistic Empire, trying to say, this is how we succeeded during the Persian times. We can succeed now. And the conflict between North and South continues on. And Samaria versus Jerusalem and all that. And, the parable of the Good Samaritan from the Gospels. I'm not a New Testament scholar. I don't know where it is. But I do write on it in the book. I just forgot right now. But it is that, I don't know if you've developed that on your own work. Have you thought about that? When the parable of the Good Samaritan is like, it's an answer to who is my neighbor. Mm-hmm. And then Jesus tells the story about the Samaritan, who's better than the Levite, who's better than the Judeans and so forth, who takes care of this guy.
Right.
And that is an attempt to say, my neighbor, we are one people. The North and the South, so Jesus was very much about, there is a larger community. It's not just about Judeans. It's not just about Jews. There's a larger kind of concept of a more broader people of Israel, if you will. And a lot of people have read the Good Samaritan parable as, you should love everyone, or everyone is our neighbor. But Jesus didn't tell a story about the Roman soldier. It's not like trying to say we should love the Roman soldiers are our neighbors. No, it's the Samaritans. They're our neighbor. And that just continues the kinds of texts that we find in the Book of Chronicles and so forth that try to show, Judah must treat Samaria better. Samaria must treat, and it's just all one way it develops.
And it kind of also tells me, as someone who sees it all the way here in this late 1st century material, possibly early 2nd, depending on the book, is that there's still a struggle between these two category of people. And so this goes on for centuries where they're competing. And I imagine there are other versions of Judaism.
Well, it really, what's the truth behind your position is that it really starts to emerge under the Persian and Hellenistic period in a new way. So there are these kingdoms that fought with each other, but there was no struggle because the northern kingdom was just strong and didn't even care about Judah. The northern kingdom gets wiped out. It's Judah, the southern kingdom, who cares about trying to usurp that position, usurp that tradition, and trying to make it their own. So Jerusalem, after Samaria is gone, Jerusalem's trying very hard. But that all of it is very much a part of, after they're both of them gone, now Judah and Samaria are struggling. And so much of the biblical record in the Hebrew Bible belongs to the same conversation that is in the New Testament. And a lot of scholars want to say, there's the Old Testament, and the Old Testament period ends, and then there are these centuries, the intertestamental period, and in the New Testament, as if there's this big gap. My scholarship is saying there's no intertestamental period. It's the intertestamental period is when the Bible emerged in the first place.
Wow. Drop your mic. All right. That was powerful. There's so much that your book gets into and covering. I love that you bring up Ezra and Nehemiah. You're talking about a lot of these later books and reshaping earlier ones. I think this is like the most clear, profound way of approaching why the Bible was written. And I wondered, this is a little speculative. I understand there's scholarship like Jan Vim Vasilius. I butcher these names. Wrote proposing whether or not this is true. It's still an interesting hypothesis. The 9 books of Herodotus, his histories, were possibly competitor kind of narratives because we know that it's writing about Persia and Greece and what happened between Xerxes and King Cyrus, which is a huge player in the Bible. So we have these huge players that connect the dots between Herodotus's histories with these really well-known Persian kings, and to them they're significant. He even paints their divine narratives, all that kind of stuff from the Greek perspective of explaining the Persian Empire. Then you have the biblical, and for crying out loud, Cyrus is the Messiah. What are your thoughts about this? Whether or not he's completely right on they modeled their mythical past of history and comparing it and try to create like a new histories Herodotus kind of thing. What do you think about this weird thing happening here with Herodotus and the biblical narrative and this pivotal point with Persia?
Okay, so that's not my field of expertise by any means. Herodotus is something I use quite a bit, but there are other scholars who are trying to show the connections between the kinds of history writing we have, like in the Bible, in Herodotus. And in some cases, they're not, they may be conservative scholars. One of them was Gary Knoppers of blessed memory. And he was, in some ways, a conservative scholar, but he was an expert on the Greek stuff. And he really shows how much of it is in the Bible against his intentions. Not that he was a fundamentalist by any ways. He grew up a fundamentalist, but his scholarship really makes a case for that. It's something that I have not worked on in that kind of direction and with that objective, but some of the stuff that we're seeing in the biblical record in terms of trying to create a narrative, trying to connect the dots, that's new. We don't have narratives of peoples in relation to other peoples like we have in Herodotus and Thucydides and in Greek history writing. We don't have that in the ancient Near East, but we have it in the Bible. Then the question is, so what's the connection? What's the connection between the Greek history writing and the biblical narratives? Because the biblical narratives stand out in their West Asian, Canaanite environment.
And I think this confuses many academics. I'm sorry at butting in. I just think this is a good conversation with you, Dr. Wright. You're right on. You're so open-minded, but also very careful. And I respect your decision on not even jumping to conclusions, but you're doing what I love. And that is thinking and having our audience think with us. Yeah. So this interesting point you bring up, it is very easy to pin the tail on the donkey for the Bible when you see, what looks like Canaanite, Ugaritic names for deities, possible Akkadian loan words. I mean, all of that stuff really points to this West Semitic or Southwest Asian context. And yet it's structured and modeled in a way that is competitive and even similar in many ways to how Greeks narrate in so many ways. So my question, and I'm throwing this to see what spaghetti sticks to the wall with you, is that, could we be taking old traditions, like you said, rewriting them under the context and pin of someone educated with the Greek awareness of how they write their literature, yet giving their heritage, their Semitic background, avoiding Greek loan words as much as often as possible, all of that?
I think you're right. And it's like scholars go through the text with a fine-tooth comb, trying to find an Akkadian loan word or some kind of evidence for an Iron Age dating, which means like before defeat. They're very interested in the Iron Age because, once again, they want to get away from defeat. They don't, because that makes it all human, thoroughly human, all too human. as Nietzsche said. And so you have to remember that in our own languages, in our own traditions, we have loan words that are or sayings that are very ancient. We don't even know where they come from. They could be centuries old. That doesn't mean if somebody in 1,000 years from now found one of our letters or our text or whatever, and we use some kind of expression that actually emerged 300 or 400 years ago, that someone could make a case, well, this text on this iPhone that we found, actually, we're going to have to date the whole iPhone 300 years earlier because it has this word in it. And that's almost what they do. Like, well, there's one word in this text, therefore we're going to date it all 300 years earlier than what critical scholars say. And even critical scholars do that. It's hard. We should talk sometime about how the field works, because there's the SBL, the Society of Biblical Literature, is this huge guild of scholars. There's evangelicals, there are Jews, there are critical scholars, there's a whole spectrum of where my point is that the critical scholars that are really useful to read, they still kind of make things fuzzy by saying, here are some loan words. We have to be skeptical about late datings. It may be not, but this loan word shows that it could be early. And it's like, that's not helpful, because the whole picture just fits so well. And I think I lay that out in a new way so that it resonates with people. And you'll have to see how I do it. And I think that's good. Listen, the reception is really good by non-biblical scholars. It also is by biblical scholars, but I think that the biblical scholars kind of gulp from it. Because
you think that's because it's competing? It's almost like, how dare you steal my thunder?
No, it's not about that. I'm just like popularizing. That's not what I'm doing. Actually, the book, I did not expect it ever to take off. I didn't write a popular book. It's by Cambridge University Press. Someone sent it to Gopnik, who's this like literary critic in New York who only reviews several books a year. And he picked it up and said, damn. And he wrote a review of it in the New Yorker, which blew me away, blew everybody away. And there's other people who are doing that because they don't have any vested interest in this. I wrote this book actually for scholars and for students. I did not write it for it's easy to read because I don't like to write things in a complex matter, because a part of scholarship that I think you appreciate is taking very complex matters and making them easy to understand. Yes. And I have I think a knack for that, at least in the writing. I'm not sure I do it in communication as well, in oral communication, but in the writing, I do that, I think, pretty well. And what they're mad about is that it's setting out so easily for a broad audience, an idea something that they may have been worried about, but no one had really developed and taken all the way. There was one guy, the Germans, right? The Germans are still the best, I think, in terms of critical research, not only in biblical stuff, but in a wide array of things. Just wonderful universities where they have total freedom from the religious institutions, so that they really are supposed to be scholars without any kind of, and that lends to cutting edge research. So this guy, Julius Wellhausen, like around 1900, he came up with the idea, or didn't come up with it, but he developed it a bit about defeat. And once again, kind of fuzzy, but pretty clear. He had to leave the theological faculty for it. He had to go to another school and teach in it. And Wellhausen is, for many people in my field, respected, but kind of seen as the devil. And why? Why is he the devil? Because he just lays out things that people see, damn, that makes sense, but I'm going to work my whole career to show that it's more complicated than what he says. And if I can just add a little bit of nuance to it, people might just throw him all the way out with the bathwater. And I don't think Wellhausen gets it right in many ways. And I try to really show that it's much more concerted effort after defeat. He has a lot of stuff that goes all the way back to Moses, but writing in 1900, that's forgivable.
Right. You're 100. And I read some of that 10th century, 11th century BCE, and I'm like, I breathe.
Yeah.
And
I mean, when he was saying that, it was radical because he left some stuff that may go back to Moses or whatever,
right.
but he took so much away from Moses and from David and from all of them that he got in a lot of trouble. And today, I take everything away from them. And yeah, well,
other than possibly, and I say possibly, a memory. And but even then, like, you can't prove anything based on a memory. And if the and I'm talking about the memory of a dynasty or a people, but the fact that they constructed this narrative and it goes against archaeology, you're really, like, your book is going to show, like, you're really barking up the wrong tree of assuming this is what actually happened as it's documented. Is there a name of a guy from way back? Probably. Could be. That's but at that point, what's the important point? It's really the story that you're reading, rather than could they have known a name from 500 years ago that's Southwest Asian in heritage or something, or a dynasty of a tribal people, all these interesting things.
I think that also, if I might add, this point is that there have been scholars who like downdate everything, make it to the Greek period, and they're often very simplistic.
Right.
And what makes my work controversial is that no one has ever said Jacob Wright is simplistic. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot of archaeology. One of the most respected biblical scholars in Hebrew Bible. I teach at the top program in PhD studies at Emory University. All of that. So it's not somebody who has an agenda to kind of just debunk the Bible.
Right.
I'm an intellectual, and I want to be honest about it, because I think we learn a lot about how humans respond to catastrophe. And we're facing catastrophes right now. We're arguing with each other as if we have all the time in the world, but if you can see where we are, we're on the brink of disaster, like ready to fall over a cliff. And I think we need truth in our time. And we need good scholars to do this, and scholars who have courage. And it showed me also the reception, which is nice, that if you have the courage and you write with beauty and clarity, it will gain traction among people who I really care about, like Adam Gopnik, and not worrying about what my colleagues in the field who are going to nitpick with me. I don't care about them anymore.
Well, let me ask you this about the book. And if you could tease us with a few examples off the top of your head that you could think of. Early in the book, the Bible, I'm speaking of, can you hint at some key elements among these books that tell us or hint at us? So what are some of the motifs that say, hey, this happened after the destruction of Babylon or post-Persia or something? Is there a certain theme that we see?
Well, we talked about the Exodus, right? So that's a big one. And as I said, there's a longstanding move between Egypt and other places. But what we have in the Exodus story of the book of Exodus of the Bible is very much an attempt to say, we did it without the king. We no longer have a king. And therefore it's all, our God, and we can be still saved, Now, what about Genesis that comes before Exodus? Well, Genesis is very hard for people to understand. Well, how is that a response to defeat? It's just about, Abram and Sarah and everybody just making a family and growing and all the family disputes. What the book of Genesis is about is that we have to remember that Abram and Isaac and Jacob and all the children and all of the women themselves represent different communities, different regions, different territories. These are not just stories about people. They are myths about ancestors, and the communities are often named after the ancestors. So all of the 12 sons of Jacob, those are names of tribes in regions. They have nothing to do with individual figures until the biblical authors make them into some kind of ancestors that were connected, and the names that they have are the ones that they give to their posterity. But that's all an attempt to say all of these communities, we go back to one family. Now that we're defeated and conquered, we got to come together. We were a family, a nation, emerging way back in the midst of the ancient world, whatever. You get the point. Way back in the early history, we came together and a family emerged, and we can do that now today. And that is very much an attempt to say that before we had a kingdom, right? Once again, the kingdom's not there. What brought us together was our worship of one God, of this Yahweh. And that is their attempt, their theological attempt to connect the dots, meaning connect all of these different regions and say, let's come together around this. But they do it also in a family story that is, remember, Abraham is chosen by Yahweh, Abraham and Sarah. And so the narrative is very much about a deity and a people who emerge into a family. And that story then lays the groundwork for families in the post-exilic period, meaning after the destruction, to kind of return to that model of we can still be a larger family, if you will. Our communities can come together because we did it long ago. And I'm not making that all up. It sounds like, well, what evidence do you have for that? We can find all of these names and different things in the older sources as well as extra biblical sources, and they have nothing to do with the book of Genesis.
Right.
And the book of Genesis is what creates a narrative out of them.
So you have family bonds or mythic narratives constructing how these other tribes and various groups actually connect in our family, which is interesting. It's a genealogy. You also see a lot of those genealogy kind of moves with the Greeks, the way that they have genealogies as well. But I think of the Sumerian kings list, but it's not quite the same. That's really, those are all kings. And so what I find interesting about what you're saying is you got, let's create a past for these tribes. You also are saying this is post monarch. So now you're meaning, or better yet, this is post us having kings, which is why the narrative.
So you mentioned this. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
The Sumerian king list. I talk about that, and it's so there's this narrative from one king to the next king to the next king, and we have them in the Bible from one king to the next king. And the Sumerian king list is very, very old, right? Older than the Bible. But you couldn't make a case that the Bible is old on that basis, because the way the Sumerian king list works, it's all about the kings. And the biblical sources are saying, yes, there's some kings and there's dynasties and so forth, but they're they're not at the beginning of our history, right? They create a mythic prehistory.
Right.
And that goes for most of the Bible, from Genesis all the way to the narrative of, just to remind you, is from Genesis to the book of Kings. The book of Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem. We don't have that in Christian Bibles, but in the Jewish Bible, and you can see it a little bit in the Christian Bibles, that's the original narrative. It ends with defeat. And that narrative only has one book, really, maybe two books, the book of Samuel and Kings, that talk about this. All the other stuff that people read today, no one reads the book of Kings, right? No one teaches the book of Kings, maybe a few stories about Elijah and Elisha, but it's not really stuff that people get most of their theology from. They get their theology from Pentateuch, from Genesis, from all of that stuff. And all of that stuff is very easy to see as a way to preface this history with all of these things that are going to be essential strategies for survival for communities who no longer have that kingdom. Once again, go ahead.
I was going to say the Judges condemns the idea of kings. Like, they're already pointing toward the idea of kings are coming, and you're going to see why that isn't good. But at the same time, you're also seeing promises of like later, so they can't let go of the memory or the idea of us. One day the Messiah will come, and one day, we'll have this kingship that'll be ruled by God, where God will actually come in. So they kind of don't want to let go of that, but they also have to explain why we don't have that.
Yeah. And one of the more important points about this is that you have people who are looking at the book of Genesis and they find these parallels, and they're trying to make a story about how things come together, let's say in ancient, oral tradition, and this goes way back and so forth. And I'm trying to show it's not oral tradition that makes these stories. It's not something that goes way back. It's the attempt by scribes. So to answer the question of like, who wrote the Bible? It's attempt by nameless scribes over generations to connect various communities together in a literary way through text, not through oral traditions, not through things that people knew all the time. There is one kind of new approach, the documentary hypothesis, right? It goes back to Wellhouse, and he was the one who really popularized it. It's the JEPD. I don't know if
Yes.
your viewers will know a lot about that, but it's not useful anymore to know, because that theory really doesn't hold water very much. That theory says all these sources go back to the kingdom period or earlier. Right. Even the latest source, the priestly source, is like pre-exilic. If that's the case, and most Americans kind of follow that, if that's the case, then my whole thesis is wrong. I'm saying everything is a response to the defeat. And there's a neo-documentary hypothesis, and it's defended by some scholars at big schools throughout the US. And it tries to argue that actually these sources, they knew nothing of each other. So there's the one source that tells about the Exodus and another story that tells about the Exodus, but they don't know each other. These sources, whatever, how you imagine that. And the problem with that is they can make a claim that because these sources are telling about the Exodus independently of each other, that there must have been a common tradition about the Exodus.
Right, right.
So our approach that I learned from Germany, in my work in Germany, I spent most of my studies there, is no, there is a text. It's like a snowball, and it grows in each generation. So there's this kind of early idea about this Exodus, and it just emerges. Or the early idea about maybe some ancestors, but you can't get back to it very much, but you can see how it grows in each generation. It's not a bunch of independent sources that were compiled like these neo-documentarians say. They were compiled by one editor. These are older historical sources. Right. They may not tell the history, but what they do show us is that everybody kind of agreed on the basic outline of Israel's history. And I try to show the basic outline of Israel's history is a construction by very intelligent scribes, but they're doing it with an eye to their communities, bringing them together, unifying them, trying to give them something that will hold them together when they no longer have a palace to do so.
So just to emphasize this, I'm glad you went into more weeds here, because people on my channel are very sharp. They love the deeper, more critical, let's get into the mechanics of Dr. Wright's position here, because he's saying something, it resonates, what he's saying makes sense, it explains this broader picture. But what do we do with this juggernaut, I'll call it, in scholarship that is almost, I'm going to use this is going to upset some of my friends who are scholars who might watch this, but almost a dogma that you have to regurgitate in American scholarship of, documentary hypothesis is the gospel. And you start challenging that, you're fighting against, your community of academics.
Oh, yeah, they're very vicious. A lot of the scholars who are defending this documentary hypothesis, they can get very personal in their attacks. It's just, I don't know what rides on it. I don't know why they're so personally invested in it. Some of them claim not to be religious very much at all. But once you start, I think once again, it's like with the reception of the book, things just make sense very much. And because if it weren't compelling at all, they wouldn't worry about it, right? We get angry about the things that are closest to home and closest to the truth. If it's so outlandish, who cares?
Well,
there's some validity to it and it seems coherent and it could be true, oh man, you're going to have to take that down and start getting ad hominem and all kinds of stuff. And it's just a mess.
Well, let's pick apart a few things if I can with you, just to get your thoughts. And some of this, keep in mind, I'm sure is in your book or would take longer than our video would allow. You have a lot of the JEDP and hypothesis out here that wants to put stuff way, way back. And they have this kind of idea that, well, you might find J way, way back here, or D.
They say all the way to King David or Solomon.
Right. And much of them will go 8th, 9th, 10th dynasty on some of these sources not dynasty, century BC. And then some of them they'll say is Persian or, granting this like final touch in the Persian. And you're saying, actually, my friends, we're crafting Persian onward the whole picture, not saying they're not using ancient sources or ideas that might be there, but this evolution, this snowball rolling way back here of these materials, and then there's like composite materials that are simultaneous traditions that contradict. So the question I have about that, and I know that we're way in the weeds on trying to do this in a video, but what do you do with doublets, triplets, when there's contradictory material?
Okay.
Like, how do you explain what you think's happening? Whereas they see it and they go, we've got a creation account in Genesis 1, we've got a creation account in Genesis 2, and they're two completely different accounts. One's 300 years before the other. They, they'll throw numbers around. We don't know. But then I come to another scholar, and I'm giving both sides of the coin here, and they say, actually, if you look in Plato's Timaeus, for example, he has a cosmological ultimate crafter narrative of the divine creation of all creation, like all the earth and heavens and all. And then you have a generation of Gaia and Uranos, heaven and earth. It's a second creation where the lesser gods are actually able to create mortals. It's a separate creation story side by side in Plato. So you have Timaeus, which is giving you two creation accounts side by side. And then you have this idea that like actually Genesis 1 contradicts Genesis 2 so much. They're two separate, completely different, disparate traditions that some later scribe put together. Where are you leaning, and how would you answer some of these problems that they try to solve?
Yeah. So doublets are not an indication of two different sources. They can be in some cases, but they're not necessarily so. And those were like you point out, if there's parallels and they tell the same thing, then it must be two different sources. Here's an easier explanation to use Occam's razor. Occam's razor is if you can explain it with fewer factors, then go with that. You don't need to multiply the factors, right? If you can explain this evolved from you don't need to go to God to explain it. Right? That's just not helpful. And by the way, I lay that out in my book. A lot of religious people, why do we have a Bible? Well, God wanted us to have a Bible. And you're asking, well, why did we have trees? Well, trees, right? We don't make that kind of, if the wildlife biologist said, well, we have trees, or the botanist said we have trees because God wanted us to have trees, we wouldn't be going to that botanist and reading books, right? And so we have to look for the more immediate reasons. And on the two sources, the easiest way, the Occam's razor is, there's an older story, not old story, an older, an earlier one. It's in Genesis 2. And Genesis 1 is a new attempt to tell that story, and it gets prefaced to it. So instead of two sources, you just have a text that is like a snowball. By the way, Genesis 2 is itself very late. But whatever it is, you have a text, and then you have text growing around it like a snowball as it rolls down the hill. It's not the reason why the whole documentary hypothesis emerged was not because they were trying to defend the authority of Scripture necessarily. They were doing this just because they had to explain the doublets and so forth, all the duplication. Mm-hmm. This goes way back into the 1800s. But it has become, within scholarship for the last 50 years, a conservative position, because one could use it to say there are independent sources, and they tell the same story roughly, that God created the earth, and that there was an Exodus, that there is Abraham. There are two sources that mention Abraham, and it's like, no, there is an older story that tells about Abraham, and there are new additions to that story. And the older story itself is not very old, because, by the way, Jacob isn't the older. Jacob's is Israel. Right. And what they want to do with Abraham, by saying Abraham was Jacob's grandfather, was to create a new figure at a very late point that would unify. Jacob, remember, is Israel, the north. And if it's all the northern traditions, the Judeans need somebody who says, this is our ancestor, and he was before Jacob. And Abraham, if you remember, he's down in Hebron and in Judah in the south. So they use a southern ancestor, and he's a late invention. There are Greek influences there too. Thomas Romer, a very respected scholar, talks about Moses and Abraham by comparing Greek sources. And by the way, we know so much about Moses, or we have a lot of stories about Moses from late Hellenistic sources about how he's a warrior and so forth. And you see how Moses in this period, in the Hellenistic period, is really getting a lot of traction. And so to put it simply, there is an earlier story, not an old story, but an earlier story. And then there are responses to it. And there are attempts to say, well, let's do a new version of that. And they grow. And
is it safe to say that they started that task post-destruction? So the older story may have actually been one of the earliest things they had initially started post-destruction. Yeah. And then it rolls from there. Is that your
exactly. And so it's not like when I say older that it goes all the way back to some kind of historic memory or something. It's just an attempt to connect the dots and to create a myth that will unify dispersed, exiled communities and say, listen, we were connected already back then. And then people say, well, let's nuance that a little bit more and add some other things. And they tell the story twice. And the story that comes before it is the one that gets preference, because the best way to reorient a work is not to add a new appendix to it, because no one will get to it. It's always to add the introduction. And there's a great scholar, Sarah Milstein, who talks about redaction through introduction, meaning you take a text and you redact it by putting a new introduction so that when one reads everything after it, one reads through the lens of that new text. And that can be demonstrated by across the Bible, but a lot of other kinds of materials from the ancient world.
I was going to ask you, like, when we get into King David's story, right? You have a whitewashed version, it seems, and then you have a version that's like, this guy was like a murdering crazy, like this guy did some horrible things. And I know that like Joel Baden and others who've written on that try to.
So you have to start out, 1 Samuel 17 is the story of David and Goliath, where he's just a hero. He trusted Yahweh. His brothers are scared. He has a lot of courage. But 1 Samuel 17 is one of the latest texts of David, right? And we have the Greek version, the Septuagint version, which is even simpler. And we can see how the Hebrew version is later than the Greek version. And it's a late text to kind of say, before David actually became this reprobate, he started out as a pretty good guy. And so that's an attempt, like through introduction, to say we can actually be nice to David because he went off the wrong way, but he began well.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So bonus material for you viewers who've made it this far. And I'm glad you saw the teaser in the beginning of this video of some of the things we discussed. Elephantine. I need to talk about this very, very controversial settlement, a Jewish settlement, a Yahwist Jewish settlement with their own temple that is not central, as Deuteronomy wants to put it, in Jerusalem. They're writing letters to Jerusalem asking to rebuild it. Egyptians burn it down because I think, if I'm not mistaken, they're sacrificing certain animals that they found sacred and holy. And there might even be hints in the Exodus. I heard from one scholar saying that this is Exodus and its final redactions are happening so late that there might be hints at Elephantine in that material, trying to say like, hey, the Egyptians are not okay with you guys killing these certain animals in your temple. I don't know that for certain.
No, there is a lot to that. And
tell us about it.
I'm an expert on the Persian period. And my first book was on Ezra Nehemiah and all that. And Ezra Nehemiah talks about, okay, the Jews after the destruction during the time of Cyrus and the Persian Empire and all the kings that came after, they returned and they finally got their shit together. They finally came together and started refocusing their life on the Torah, on the law, on the temple, on obedience and service to Yahweh. And that's the ideal period because that's where the community is fully devoted to the Bible in a certain sense, right? The Bible doesn't exist yet, but the text, They call it the Torah, the books of Moses. And everything after that is just commentary, right? All the religion, Christianity, and Jewish, Judaism, and so forth is just kind of builds on that. What is true about that is, yes, Judaism builds on Ezra, Nehemiah, and Christianity and so forth, a community that comes together and wants to have the text read, like in church services today. It builds on that, but that's all aspiration of the scribes. That's a kind of vision for the. That was not the case in the Persian period. Even in the Persian period, in the late Persian period, the text from Elephantina, from this little colony down on the Nile, guarding the Persian Empire. There were Jewish soldiers there and their families. They're guarding the borders of the Persian Empire. And we have all kinds of texts, most amazing stuff. We don't have any archive for a community that was related to Judah anywhere else like that, to that amount of detail. So we know very well about how they lived and thought. And you know what? They write to Jerusalem about questions around their temple and about how they should do sacrifices and so forth. No one ever says, we looked for the Torah, we looked for the books of Moses, not only in Elephantina, but the priest in Jerusalem. They don't even seem to presuppose the existence of a Torah. Not that the Torah is not growing there, but it's kind of a side project. It's a plan B. It's a minority report, if you will. It's not the main thing, even in the Persian period. So Ezra Nehemiah has to be a kind of fiction, a kind of aspiration. Maybe we should go there. These are scribes imagining a community that gathers around their writing technology, text and scrolls. But the Elephantina evidence shows that there is a community. They write to Jerusalem. They worship Yahweh, but they worship Yahweh's wife too. They worship they give money to sacrifices to Khnum and other Egyptian gods and so forth. It seems, I don't want to get into all the details, but they have a lot of different things that are just clearly idolatrous. And the priests in Jerusalem and the authorities in Jerusalem they should say, we would expect them to say, we have nothing to do with you backsliders. We will have nothing to do with your community. We are not going to support you to build a temple to Yahweh and his wife. The only temple, according to the Torah, is to be built in Jerusalem. That's what the Bible says. Only the one place where, we have the evidence. We know all about it. The temple's destroyed. They're trying to rebuild it. They're writing to Jerusalem for help. And no one ever thinks to say, you guys are backsliders. You guys are doing evil stuff. No, they accept what they do. And so this all shows that this mentality of monotheism, of text, of Torah, of commandments, of everything we take for granted in the Bible, that it might have existed, but it was a very small little project among scribes, a few circles, and it was just getting going. And it doesn't gain traction until centuries later, right? It's the Maccabees who really are the ones during the 2nd century who are going to bring the Torah to the center of the community. Before that, even though Ezra Nehemiah says it was, in keeping with the divine plan, after they had been conquered, they repent and return. But we know that's not the case. We know that's just, once again, an attempt to create a mythic past to say that this is what we're doing now is the way we were doing it back then when we got our stuff together.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have to get a copy of Why the Bible Began, an alternative history of scripture and its origins. Dr. Jacob L. Wright, you've been fantastic. I love you as a guest. I want to have you back.
I like working with you. We need to do it again. That's fun.
I swear, everybody in the chat, go down, get a copy, drop a comment on this discussion. I loved this, and I know that people will as well. Dr. Wright may just take a gander and look through the comments and see the praise and stuff. So show him some love. We'll have him come back as well. This book is fantastic. I've never read anything like it, the way that you've wrote it. I hope this thing reaches the moon, my friend.
Well, thank you. Hank is ready to go for a walk. Hank, you ready to go for a walk? Can you see? He's so tired of hearing about the Bible. Every time he hears the Bible, he lies down and takes a nap or gets up and goes down to the basement. The word Bible is like, ugh.
I really, really, though, seriously appreciate your time. And I hope that your dog doesn't hate me yet. And
His
that
name is
we
Hank
can,
Van Aaron. He's a priest.
but let's do this again. And maybe the audience will have some ideas once they've read the book, can tell us what they'd like to see us discuss further or elaborate that they thought was amazing about the book and tease the world with. But I
Yeah,
do
I'm
hope
happy to come on and talk about more about the Eleventina stuff or the archives, because that's will get us into the weeds, but in a very concrete way. We talked a lot about kind of the theories and the setting and how this all works within biblical scholarship, where we expect them to be much more critical than they are, and they're not. But we need to talk about the heart. People need to be equipped with knowing about, here are 3 archives. And these archives make it very difficult to accept the biblical narrative, but they help us understand why we have a biblical narrative.
Right.
We can appreciate the story when we understand it's not history.
Wow. And I think that's where the power of it is. It's in the story. It's not in the reality of it actually being the case. That we watch movies like that all the time. So any final words from you, Dr. Wright?
Well, I appreciate all you're doing to bring scholarship to a wider audience, and also bringing scholarship that is critical. And it's weird that we can have these conversations with you that we can't really have within the guild, because people are just always trying, well, and it's nice just to, like we say in Yiddish, let's talk tacheles. Let's just get it right out and just knock it out. And that's going to be helpful because we want to do business.
Maybe Myth Vision will become a scholarly therapist session for scholars who really want to say what they really think and not have to worry about a thing.
In this very safe environment that you create for us.
Thank you. I try to be all things to all men and do it better than Paul did. So, bear with me.
Well, I appreciate you, brother.
Thank you. And ladies and gentlemen, sometimes, it's a human thing that we, have our memory sometimes lapse or cognitive dissonance. Maybe sometimes we're sleepwalking. But in case you are, let me help you out. Never, ever forget, we are Myth Vision.